By the summer of 1944, more than 400,000 German soldiers were living inside the United States, not as conquerors, not as spies, as prisoners of war, eating American food, sleeping in American barracks, earning American wages, and working American farmland from Nebraska to Texas to the cotton fields of Alabama. Their families, back in a bombed and rationed Germany, could barely imagine it. One prisoner wrote home to describe where he had landed. He called it a golden cage. That phrase captures something that still astonishes. These were men who had been told, in some cases explicitly, that capture by the Americans meant mistreatment, exploitation, or worse. Nazi propaganda had painted the enemy as barbaric, yet when the reality of American captivity arrived, the mess hall food, the baseball diamonds, the canteens stocked with candy and tobacco, the paycheck at the end of the week, most of these men did not find a horror story. They found something that unsettled them in a different way entirely. They found abundance, order, and a functioning democracy operating exactly as advertised right in front of their eyes. And by the time the last ship of German prisoners sailed out of New Jersey in July 1946, it had left a mark on them that outlasted the war itself. This is a chapter of the Second World War that most Americans have never heard. The story begins in the desert of North Africa in 1943, with the Allied victory that changed the arithmetic of captivity. When the Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered in May of that year, the British and Americans suddenly held 250,000 prisoners, far more than Britain, already stretched thin, could house on its crowded island. The solution was the Atlantic crossing, empty transport ships returning to the United States after delivering men and materiel to the front could carry human cargo back. It was cheaper, in terms of logistics and money, to feed prisoners in Kansas than to ship food across the ocean to keep them in Britain. The Americans, who had been resistant to the idea of housing enemy soldiers on their own soil, agreed. By the fall of 1943, the camps were filling rapidly. The legal framework was the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States had ratified and intended to honor. The convention required adequate food, shelter, and medical care. It prohibited humiliating treatment. It allowed enlisted prisoners to be put to work at safe, non-military labor, and required that they be compensated. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General was given responsibility for the program, and the Army built fast. By the peak of the program, there were 155 main camps and 511 satellite facilities spread across 45 states, housed in everything from purpose-built barracks to converted hotels, courthouses, fairgrounds, and, in at least one documented case, an abandoned insane asylum. The men who arrived there stepped into a world that many of them could not immediately process. Soldiers who had grown up in the cramped Coldwater Flats of pre-war Germany, who had eaten Wehrmacht field rations and later civilian diets pinched by Allied blockades, now sat down to the same food served in American Army mess halls. Former Fort Robinson, Nebraska, prisoner Hans Vaker, who after the war became a physician and settled in Maine, later recalled it plainly. The treatment was excellent, the food was excellent, and clothing was adequate. The variety and quantity on the plates stunned men who had spent years in a country where butter, meat, and coffee had long since disappeared into rationing. The Army's kitchens operated under the Geneva Convention standard that prisoners receive nutrition equivalent to garrisoned American troops. The cooks were often the prisoners themselves, allowed to prepare their rations in the Germans' style. They ate better than their families at home. The work was part of the arrangement. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to labor, provided the tasks had no direct connection to the war effort. No weapons manufacture, no military construction. What the United States had in abundance, in addition to prisoners, was a farm labor shortage. Millions of American men were in uniform. The fields needed hands. And so German soldiers found themselves picking cotton in Texas, harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, stacking hay in Kansas, cutting timber in Oregon, and packing fruit in California. They repaired fences, worked canneries, did masonry, painted signs, and took on dozens of other tasks for private employers across the country. The financial arrangement was precise. Farmers and businesses who contracted for PW labor paid the U.S. government 45 cents an hour per man. The War Department then passed 80 cents per day to the prisoner himself, the same daily rate as a starting American Army private. To prevent prisoners from accumulating cash that might finance an escape, the wages were paid not in dollars but in canteen coupons. The men spent them on cigarettes, candy, toiletries, hobby supplies, and whatever else the camp store carried. It gave them pocket money, a degree of economic agency, and a daily demonstration of a market economy at work. Beyond the work and the wages, there was recreation. The camps organized soccer leagues and baseball games. There were theatrical productions, library shelves stocked with books, and art programs. Each prisoner, on average, watched approximately 30 films during his time in American custody. Hollywood pictures screened in camp theaters or improvised at the end of mess halls. A camp in Nebraska showed films featuring Marlene Dietrich, the famous German-born actress who had left for America, become an American citizen, and spent the war performing for Allied troops. The irony was not lost on the audiences. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Guenter Oswald, one of the few officers at Camp Trinidad, Colorado, who volunteered for work details, described an evening that no recruitment poster for the Wehrmacht had ever prepared him for. A Colorado farmer, after a day harvesting sugar beets, promised to bring his PW work crew to his home if they would sing for his German-born grandmother. "We sang," Oswald recalled, the old lady cried, "and we got lots of food and cigarettes." It was a moment that existed in no propaganda pamphlet from either side. A Luftwaffe officer singing folk songs in a Colorado farmhouse for an old woman who remembered the homeland he was fighting for. Not all of it was warmth. The camps contained a wide spectrum of men, from veteran Wehrmacht soldiers who had long since tired of the war, to committed Nazi Party members who terrorized their fellow prisoners, enforced ideological conformity, and in several documented cases, murdered those they considered collaborators or traitors. The army struggled to separate hardline Nazis from the broader population, and camp authorities did not always succeed. The tension was real, and occasionally it was deadly. There was also a deeper contradiction that the most clear-eyed German prisoners could not help but notice. The United States was showing them democracy, its prosperity, its rule of law, its decency toward even its enemies, while simultaneously operating under the segregation laws of the Jim Crow South. In camps in Texas and Alabama, the German prisoners ate in integrated mess halls, while Black American soldiers who guarded them were sometimes barred from the same facilities in the surrounding towns. Some prisoners grasped this paradox with uncomfortable clarity. They were being treated better, in some formal respects, than the American citizens who were their guards. American officials were aware of both problems. Beginning in 1944, as Allied victory came into view, the War Department quietly launched what it called the Intellectual Diversion Program, known internally as the Factory, run by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison out of Camp Kearney, Rhode Island. The program was hence kept secret because it technically skirted the line of the Geneva Convention's prohibition against political indoctrination. A carefully chosen group of American officers and anti-Nazi German émigrés worked together to produce printed materials, films, and curricula that exposed prisoners to the workings of American democracy, the history of the United States, and, critically, the documented facts of Nazi atrocities. A camp newspaper called Der Ruf, meaning the call, circulated through the camps, mixing fiction, culture, and carefully constructed democratic thinking. Committed Nazis in the camps denounced it as enemy propaganda. Most prisoners read it avidly. The American authorities were also deliberate about something simpler. They let the prisoners see America. Work details on private farms brought German soldiers into close contact with American families. Branch camps in Wisconsin, Arkansas, and dozens of other states placed prisoners in rural communities where they worked alongside locals, ate at farmhouse tables, and encountered the daily reality of civilian American life. Not the bombed wasteland and mass hunger of their propaganda's America, but the actual country, its grocery stores stocked with food, its children playing in front yards, its farmers paying their bills. All of this created an equation that expressed itself in a remarkable statistic. The escape rate from American PW camps was less than 1%. Of more than 400,000 German soldiers held in the United States, only 2,222 ever attempted to escape. Most were recaptured within 48 hours. The reason was not simply that escape was difficult, though the distance from Germany, an ocean away, made any successful long-term escape essentially impossible. The deeper reason was that many of the men did not want to leave. They were eating well, working useful work, earning small wages, and sleeping in dry barracks. The war was clearly lost. Germany was burning. And here, behind American wire, there was food, order, and a kind of peace. The golden cage was, for many of them, not entirely a complaint. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The repatriation of German POWs was complicated by post-war politics. President Harry Truman, responding to pressure from American labor unions who saw the prisoners as competition for returning GIs, ordered them sent back to Europe quickly. Many ended up not going directly home, but were transferred to British and French custody, where conditions were considerably less comfortable and where they performed the hard labor of post-war reconstruction. The last batch of prisoners held on American soil, 500 men, boarded a ship in New Jersey and sailed on July 26, 1946. By then, some had been away from their families for years. Before they left, the Provost Marshal General's office conducted a survey. The exit poll covered 153 departing German prisoners, and asked about their attitudes toward the United States and toward democracy. 74% of those men left with a favorable opinion of America and a friendly attitude toward their former captors. Some of that was self-serving. A man sailing home to a ruined country might be reluctant to criticize the nation whose labor market he intended to return to. But the numbers were too large and too consistent across the survey sample to be dismissed as politeness alone. Approximately 5,000 former German POWs eventually did return to the United States as immigrants, as professionals, as men who had seen enough of America to want to be part of it. Hans Wecker, the Fort Robinson prisoner who described excellent food and adequate clothing, settled in Maine and practiced medicine. Former prisoners sent letters home to the American families they had worked alongside. The Luchans of Murdoch, Nebraska, a farm family whose young son had played with the German prisoners who helped bring in the harvest, maintained a letter exchange for years after the war and eventually traveled to Germany to visit some of the men. In the decades that followed, small commemorations were organized across the American South and Midwest. Reunions that brought together former prisoners, the American soldiers who guarded them, and the civilians who had shared meals and fields with the enemy. Almost nothing physical remains of the camps today. The buildings were torn down. The fences came out of the ground. The land went back to farming. What lasted was harder to demolish. The United States faced an extraordinary test in those years, one that received almost none of the attention given to the battles, the weapons, or the strategies of the war. It had taken in the soldiers of the most ideologically hostile enemy it had ever faced, held them inside its own borders by the hundreds of thousands, and treated them under a standard of human dignity it had written into international law. The system was imperfect. It operated within the same nation that enforced racial segregation, that interned Japanese American citizens, and that was still, in 1945, a country full of its own contradictions. The men who administered the camps knew this, but 74% of the men who came as enemies left as something more complicated than enemies. They had seen America not as an abstraction, but as a daily reality. Its work, its food, its families, its baseball games, its newspapers, its arguments, and its freedoms. They had earned wages, watched movies, and sung folk songs in farmhouse living rooms. They had been, within the wire, something close to human beings. One of them found the only phrase that fit. He wrote it in a letter home to Germany at a time when his family could barely imagine what he was describing. He called it a golden cage, meaning presumably that he was still a prisoner, still behind wire, still far from home. But the choice of metal said everything. Not iron, not rust, gold. That letter across the Atlantic to a bombed country. What it described was the country on the other side, the one that had built 49 Zeros and tanks and 1,000 warships, and still had enough left over to feed its enemies 3 meals a day and pay them for their labor. The scale of American might was not only in the factories and the aircraft plants, it was in the mess halls of 501 camps, stretching from the cotton fields of Alabama to the sugar beet rows of Colorado, feeding 400,000 men who had come to destroy it, and sending most of them home changed.